what you or I are discussing is that at least for a few days, Russia does not control the narrative. Russia effectively had taken control of the narrative last week, which is they could portray the US and Europe, the alliance is breaking apart.
We are hearing a lot about the mineral deal that's been going on and off, should I say, between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. It seems to be back on at the moment. What should we believe it? What's the difference this time?
Yes, I mean, there is a possible minerals deal between Ukraine and the Trump administration, but I think it's really important to talk about how it took shape. This is not a standard story of Trump getting his way entirely, but it's also an incomplete story so far, and we need to explain why. The idea of Ukraine selling minerals to the United States, that's Vladimir Zelensky's idea last autumn. It was at a time when Ukraine was under great pressure from a Russian offensive, especially in the east of the country. There was uncertainty about where the U.S. election would go, so Zelensky put it out there. When the Trump administration took this up, and it appears they did so in a very rushed fashion after Trump came into office on January 20th, it no longer became a deal in which Ukraine would sell U.S. minerals. You know, with Trump's standard lines of running the government not as a president, but as the head of the Trump organization, it became his idea of Ukraine's going to pay us back for the aid that we provided since the Russian invasion began, full-scale invasion began in February 22. And the terms that they presented to Zelensky, it was almost an ultimatum on February 12th, was, all right, this is a U.S.-controlled financial venture in which you give us the minerals and we will value them to offset the aid that we have given you. And Trump came up with a figure, and there was no actual basis for this figure. He came up with a thought bubble. They're paying us back $500 billion, which is way more than the amount of U.S. aid which has even been provided, which is around about more than $100 billion so far since 22. There were no security guarantees. There was no compensation for Ukraine. So understandably, Zelensky said, no, that's just not going to fly. And the Trump people griped about it, and Trump got mad on social media. But in fact, the first part of this story, as I talked to you, is that, yeah, there was a deal that was renegotiated, which Ukraine could accept, which is instead of just simply using the revenues from minerals to repay the United States, and the U.S. controls all of that, it's a 50-50 controlled joint fund. So each party has a say in it. Ukraine contributes about 50% of the money from its income from minerals. That money then goes back into Ukraine, including, for example, recovery, reconstruction efforts, economic development. And so that's a deal Ukraine can take. You know, it's not like we're being effectively extorted for the minerals, which is what it had started off as. Now, if that goes through, that would all be well and good. But there's two things that are happening here. The first is this is in the context of the U.S. cutting out Ukraine and Europe from the direct talks with Russia, where Russia's setting the terms of those talks. But specifically on the deal, the U.S. and the Trump administration have a different vision of it in terms of security guarantees. From Ukraine's point of view, from Zelensky, they're saying, look, this is the first part of a broader agreement that we're going to seek where the U.S. guarantees our security against the current and possible future Russian invasion. Ukraine's vision of this allies, because here's the other pieces in the puzzle, which is the UK and France and other European countries, because what Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer are proposing, and what has been worked on for 18 months, is that British forces, French forces, maybe some other forces, will go into Western Ukraine to safeguard or work with air defenses to safeguard energy infrastructure and to safeguard facilities like drone manufacturing plants. Now that plan, Starmer and Macron have been open about this, needs a U.S. backstop. They want air power to protect those troops that are in Western Ukraine, not in the east near the front lines, but in the west, because the Russians do attack. They do have missile attacks. They do have drone attacks. Those U.S. warplanes would be based in Poland and in Romania, not in Ukraine, but they could provide the cover that's needed. Macron would not have presented this publicly when he talked to Trump, but that's what was going on behind the scenes. Same thing with Starmer. Now, from Zelensky's point of view, the minerals deal is tied up to that. Certain White House officials who are staying unnamed have been sniping today, and I'm speaking to you on on a Wednesday. And on this Wednesday, those White House officials say, "Oh, no. The deal, that's it. There's nothing beyond the deal. The deal is what it is." And all the deal says is that the government of the United States supports Ukraine's efforts to obtain security guarantees. In other words, from someone else. Because, piece of context, both the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and the Vice President J.D. Vance, they caused the stir 2 weeks ago at the Munich Security Conference by saying, we're going to have nothing to do with Ukraine's security. That's Europe. Europe has to do that. And of course, Hegseth and Vance went farther and effectively said, and the U.S. doesn't really want to have anything to do with European security anyway. Now, Europe and Ukraine don't want that. So they're not going to treat no security guarantees from the United States as the final answer, but some of Trump's people may want to. And that's what we have to watch for during the Starmer visit on Thursday to Washington. And then if Zelensky does get to go to Washington on Friday, if Trump officials don't pull the rug out and say no visit, then we have to see what happens between him and Trump publicly and read what happens behind the scenes from leaks to the press.
A lot of the mineral mines which are being offered essentially in this deal, I understand to be under Russian control at the moment. So how does that factor into this deal? Because is this a sign that Trump is going to be extending his support in Ukraine in order to sort of get what he wants out of this deal?
I actually think about it from a Ukrainian point of view. And there is we're talking about enough to go around. There are rare earth minerals both in the Russian occupied territories and also in the Ukrainian territory. But from a Ukrainian deal, if you say to the Americans, look, you can get revenues from these minerals across Ukraine, it gives incentive for the U.S. to support a political settlement that rolls back the Russian occupation, right? Because if the Russian occupation is rolled back under the deal with Ukraine, you can get access to the minerals. What happened on Tuesday is that Vladimir Putin made his own bid where he said to the Americans, you know what, I can give you minerals. I'll give you minerals from Russia. Oh, and I'll give you minerals from Russian occupied territory of Ukraine. Now, Putin has no legal standing to give away Ukraine's resources. Absolutely none. But of course, he doesn't care. He's trying to get Trump's ear, which is, oh, I'm going to support Russia continuing to hold on to the area of Ukraine it has, about 25% of the country, because I'll get the minerals from there. So that the thing about the minerals that was kind of throwing everybody off is it's like they think, oh, those minerals already have been developed. They can already be exploited, and that's what Trump was encouraging with this misleading idea of the 500 billion. In fact, most of those areas have not been developed. So there's a political dynamic here, which is get Trump to say, I did the deal with you, and politically he'll support you in getting the territory concerned so it can be exploited later.
So how do you think the Trump administration would be responding to Putin's offer of minerals and resources? Do you think it's kind of batting it away? Because it seems like to Trump, the art of the deal man himself, it would be the route of least resistance in a way to go with Putin over Ukraine.
We really have a fascinating story here and I'm going to sort of sidestep on that question to say, here's the context you have to approach it into. Look, Donald Trump does not approach anything as a president of the United States in the sense of U.S. security and therefore not Ukrainian security, European security. He approaches it as like he was head of the Trump organization, right? And so it's just simply a business deal. He's got other people around him who approach this in terms of that the U.S. should have nothing to do with Ukraine except to try to extract something out of it. And that's Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary, J.D. Vance, Vice President, Senior Advisor Stephen Miller, right? But there are people in the Trump administration who are playing adults in the room here. And the interesting thing is, we don't necessarily know who. because nobody knows who negotiated the revised deal with Ukraine, or they're not saying. I suspect Keith Kellogg, who is Trump's envoy to Ukraine and Russia, and who was recently in Kyiv, because he's been sidelined from the US-Russia talks. So he went to Kyiv instead. I suspect he may have a role in it, and his staff may have a role in it. I suspect there may be National Security Council staff under the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, who may be involved in it. And I suspect there's State Department staff, and there are people in the US financial sectors. And to the extent it still continues to function, because Trump and Musk are trying to rip it apart, the Department of Energy. So in other words, those career bureaucrats at some level, I think, have gotten into, and they've gotten into the deep. Now that is, in other words, they're trying to treat this in the way that a responsible negotiation should take place. The question is whether that responsible approach to negotiation continues when you've got very senior figures who could go off the rails at any minute. Trump could undo all of this with a single tweet. J.D. Vance can undo it by having another pop at Europe and saying that we're useless, like he said 2 weeks ago at Munich at the security conference. Conversely, you could have a flip where someone in the Trump administration says, not only are we talking to the Russians, in terms of these political diplomatic talks, which will resume on Thursday in Istanbul, but they could flip and say, all right, let's talk to Putin about what could be done in terms of an economic deal. So let me set out the basis for this, which will encompass it. What was really disturbing beyond the exclusion of Ukraine and Europe from the initial talks between the US and Russia last week was that Marco Rubio came out and started talking about all the great economic opportunities. Now, Russia's under sanctions. They're under international sanctions. There are no economic opportunities if Russia continues under sanctions. You can't do business with them. So what Rubio is implying is the sanctions come off, right? Would the Trump people begin to pull the sanctions off of Russia in advance of a deal to end Moscow's invasion? That's an open hanging question. And what Putin was doing with the minerals was trying to leverage that. Here's an economic interest you're going to have, right? So why don't you go ahead and pull those sanctions off of me? We'll know more tomorrow when we read the signals in terms of what's happening there.
Interesting. So you think the offer made by Putin was less of a genuine offer and more of an indication that if you remove sanctions, we will be able to perhaps have a closer economic sort of relationship?
It's both, right? So it's both. In other words, politics and economics are intertwined here, right? And again, they're especially intertwined because of the nature of Trump. You're not going to him like a Mikhail Gorbachev would have gone to Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and talked about a security agreement for both countries. You're not talking about a Bill Clinton and a Boris Yeltsin in the 90s. You're talking about Vladimir Putin, a longtime KGB officer, trained in the intelligence services, trained to find vulnerabilities and weaknesses, dealing with someone who operates from a transactional approach. Donald Trump, what can I get out of this? And so Putin is framing, this is what you can get out of this to Trump as part of the attempt by Russia to set the terms of the entire settlement. Because at the end of the day, and let's make this clear because it's slightly beyond what we're talking about here, Vladimir Putin's goals are unchanged. He wants control of all of Ukraine. That might sound strange because he only occupies about 25% of it. But I was actually in a conversation on another outlet with someone named Sergei Markov, who is very well connected to the Kremlin. And Sergei Markov, point blank, said, this is a criminal regime in Ukraine. It's been criminal since 2014. It has to go. And then Vladimir Putin, in a discussion yesterday with officials, specifically said that the Zelensky government has to be removed. In other words, they want a government who answers to Moscow, which is what they had before 2014. How Putin gets there is he's going to try to get there step by step. Part of the steps are to relieve the economic pressure on Russia. Part of the steps are to, if not recognize the annexation, Russia's annexation of those 4 regions plus Crimea, to allow them to stay there, And then he will keep trying to chip away at the legitimacy of Zelensky by splitting the US from Europe.
So, looking ahead to the meeting between Starmer and Trump tomorrow, how does surely it can't be a coincidence that the mineral deal is also working out in a similar timeline as the meeting with Macron as well?
No, it's not a coincidence at all. I mean, the fact of the matter is that you have to put all of this together, which is Emmanuel Macron goes in Monday. He goes on Monday, not publicly, but privately, but behind the scenes, French officials will be there. And they'll be talking about stationing British and French forces in Western Ukraine. Can you give us the backstop? U.S. air power. Macron reports back today to European leaders, gets support from European leaders. Starmer goes tomorrow with that support, renews the discussion, hopefully with the adults in the room. In other words, from the various U.S. agencies, the various U.S. officials. Then you come out with a line which says, we've got a plan that's forming shape here, and you present it to Trump and his inner circle. That Zelensky goes on Friday, signs the agreement, which gives Trump what he wants in terms of the minerals, gives Trump the photo opportunity. Now you've appealed to his ego, and now you're on a better basis to present the plan. That's an optimal scenario. Now, Macron did a really good job on Monday. He did a really good job at both playing up to Trump's ego, but also not giving away before Trump. That moment where he, interrupts Trump, puts his hand in his arm and says, no, actually, Europe's given a lot of aid to Ukraine. We're not just simply trying to claw all the money back. How Starmer performs tomorrow is going to be really, really important. I would actually argue this is one of the most important days for a British prime minister. Since the end of the Cold War. I'd say that, in terms of key issues of vital security, you could possibly say go back to Blair in terms of Iraq, but I don't like that example. You could go back to Thatcher in the 1980s and her relationship with Reagan. I think Starmer's.
So, aside from best possible outcomes, what do you think the likely outcomes will be? Do you think Starmer's defense spending increase will be enough to flatter Trump, along with a photo opportunity and potential invite to the UK again?
I think that'll flatter Trump. Now the question here is there some who are sharper than Trump, and whether they're won over? I don't. You've got an unqualified defense secretary, first of all. That jams things up. Pete Hegseth. You've got a vice president who hates Europe, J.D. Vance. You have got a national security advisor, Mike Waltz, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who reportedly are worried about losing their jobs if they get too out of line with Trump, right? Do they actually maneuver where you can still support European interests there? That's all in play there. I just think all you want to do at Europe at this point is you want to keep this option open, because if the talk is about security guarantees for Ukraine, and if that's the live option, it takes priority over the U.S.-Russian talks. And right now, the Russians aren't making their demands. Right now, the Russians are only saying that those talks are about effectively reopening diplomatic facilities, about giving diplomats more freedom of action, because a lot of this has been cut back because of Ukraine. They're only actually preparing the ground for what their ask is going to be later on. So you've got this window where you say security guarantees are the key issue. Let's keep that discussing. As long as that's not closed off by Trump and his inner circle, then you still got room for maneuver.
What was this not already closed off by Trump, though? Sort of when the first initial communications were coming out from the administration, one of the things was there would not be US backing. If something happens, don't come to us. We won't be involved.
Well, like I said, the thing here is that obviously there are U.S. officials who've been working with Ukraine in terms of getting the revised draft of the agreement. That's what makes this very unusual. And I was pessimistic. I didn't think it would come off. And another reason why I didn't think it would come off is because Musk and Trump are waging terror on U.S. agencies. So I didn't know if you had enough career officials who actually would be able to do this, because their agencies are being paralyzed or at threat of being paralyzed, but they have. They've gotten it to this point. And remember also, there's another place where these discussions take place, and I think a lot of news media haven't really picked up on it, and that's NATO, right? U.S. counterparts can talk to European counterparts at NATO, and they are outside the Washington bubble. And that's huge, Because these plans we're talking about, which is for the security guarantee, which is the British and French troops, backstopped by the Americans, those discussions were going on in the halls of NATO, although it's not a NATO plan, I have to add. That's sort of a space where the adults can get together and where they can congregate. And I think that may be the answer to why we're getting a little bit of, it's not all done and dusted that Trump's simply going to be in Putin's pocket.
You've mentioned it a couple of times that, ironically enough, from my own observation at least, that Trump's administration seems to have sort of fostered this, for lack of a better way of putting it, a deep state that is working in spite of him to try and achieve certain objectives that will in this case, help Ukraine.
You've got different tracks going on in Washington. And a lot of what the media is watching is they're watching, for example, the cabinet meeting, that farce at the cabinet meeting today, where Elon Musk is standing up as the unelected co-president and talking about how he's going to save America $1 trillion, how he's going to send out another email that people will have to answer to about the 5 things they did this week. And then Trump goes around the table and says, does everybody like Elon? And they go, oh, yeah, they're good. I mean, there's that type of ludicrous performance. And then those people, some of whom had been under threat of being fired, who are actually doing their jobs, right? And what happens is that the press doesn't really cover the day-to-day what people are doing with their jobs because it's not as interesting as the circus. But if you are a Ukrainian official, you're finding your counterpart in the U.S. that you're going to try to work with who does that job. If you're a European official, you're trying to work with them in terms of this. So, my sense here is that there are officials in the Trump administration, and remember, there are officials in Congress, because Congress will have their own staffs as well, right? And Congress has to approve financial expenditure like aid to Ukraine. So there'll be multiple places where all these discussions are going on. And that's why I get back to this, which is what has happened in what you or I are discussing is that at least for a few days, Russia does not control the narrative. Russia effectively had taken control of the narrative last week, which is they could portray the US and Europe, the alliance is breaking apart. And I think there's some truth to that, but that's a later discussion, that US and Europe are breaking apart, that Ukraine's going to be sacrificed, that they're no longer going to get the aid, and that you're going to get a world in which the US and Russia are going to make the big decisions. And that was what you had with the narrative. All of a sudden, with the minerals deal, that narrative, and with Macron and Starmer in Washington, that narrative shifts just a bit. For how long? For how long is the big question.
So it's truly a case of whoever was last in the room.
Yeah, at this point, last in the room. But I'll add something which is sort of beyond this. I mean, see, there's the thing about Russia's invasion of Ukraine is there's multiple fronts where it's taking place. And we've been talking about the political and the diplomatic front. On the actual battlefield, Russia's making gradual advances, but they are very gradual in eastern Ukraine. I think initially, we're going to talk about casualties, right? And I could talk to you about how the Russians are taking, the conservative estimate is 150,000 to 200 Russians killed. And that is a very conservative estimate. And several 100,000 are wounded. Now, Ukraine's taken losses as well. But the fact is that I think the estimate now, which has just come out, very detailed reports come out, says that more than 5 people have been killed since February 2022 for every kilometer of Ukraine that Russia's taken. So this is a bloody, costly war for them. And Ukraine is actually exacting damage from Russia right now. Ukraine's exacting damage with the attacks on oil refineries, with the attack on infrastructure, with the attacks on military facilities, because Ukraine's building up an advantage in terms of drone warfare. Now, here's the big thing. There's a lot of European and US money that's gone into that. And even if the Russians have the advantage on the ground and can hold territory, Ukraine's got the capacity to shift this battle, right? And Europe knows that. Europe knows that. That's why they wanted to keep Trump on board for another year. The combination of Ukraine, which holds part of Russia, by the way, the Kursk region, not only exacting damage, but also the fact that the Russian economy may overheat in 2025. Trump's election changed all the calculations, but there's a window here And I must emphasize a window that Zelensky and the Europeans are working for. And what is that window? Give Trump something shiny. At the end of the day, all of this detailed discussion I'm having about political, economic, military aspects, we knew from when Trump took office in 2017 that if you give him something shiny, you got a chance. The Saudis did it. The Chinese did it. UAE did it. They gave him some gold around his neck. North Korea did it when they gave him a giant envelope inviting him to North Korea. It wasn't quite so shiny, but you get my point. And now shiny minerals. That's the bauble. Will Trump tire of that? Or will Russia find something shinier to put before him?